Okay, this is Unit 12D. We're looking at dividing the political pie. And so in the last section, 12C, we looked at apportionment, which was the process used to determine the number of representatives that each state gets when they reapportioned every 10 years. Now, the apportionment is just the beginning of a lot of issues associated with electing representatives. So this first part is going to be just some background, some history on what we call redistricting, or how we oh, my pencil's not working, but basically how we divide these House seats into what we call congressional districts within each state. And then that representative is over a certain congressional district, and they represent those people called their constituents. So each representative doesn't necessarily represent the entire state, they represent their district. Now the process of drawing these boundaries is called redistricting and is quite contentious, and there's a lot of math that is involved, but in order to understand why we do some of the math, it's a good idea to get a little bit of background on some of these things. So this first part is going to be looking at the process a little bit, just some basics before we get into the math. So this idea of redistricting, based off of after a census is done, and we determine, okay, this place, this for example, this state has gone down in population, whereas another state's gone up in population. So we have one state that loses a house or two seats, and another state gains one or two. Usually, it's in the single digits, and these things are very what they call politically charged. And I hope not to make this lesson look political. This is not the place we're going to be looking strictly at the math, but again, it makes the math a little bit understandable when you know where this is coming from. But most of the people who observe politics agree that this is becoming more and more contentious each year. The two major parties that we'll be discussing, there are more parties, but are the Republican and the Democrat Party. This book calls it open political warfare. I'll leave that up to your interpretation. But it's on how these boundaries are drawn and redrawn at the beginning of each decade when we have to reapportion after our census. Now, this is nothing new. There's always been political fight back and forth. And, there's a question that the textbook asks, is there any evidence that redistricting causes problem for our democracy? And according to this author, the answer is yes. And then they provide some evidence. So again, we're going just off of what the text here provides for us. It tells a story, but it may not be the whole story. And so, again, just bear with me as we go through some of this. So you can read a little bit into what this next paragraph here is talking about. But essentially, if we look at table 12.9, so I'll just leave that paragraph there. Okay, in 12.9, if you look at the margin of victory, so here's what we call the margin of victory for the president's popular vote. So if you see a negative, that means that the president actually lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. So 2000 was President George W. Bush, 2004 was President George W. Bush, and then 2008 and 2012 was President Barack Obama, and then President Donald Trump in 2016. And so if you see a negative, again, that just means they won the Electoral College, but they did not win the popular vote. If you compare those numbers, so those are pretty tight margins. The biggest margin was in 2008, but those are pretty tight margins. Now, if we compare that to the average House of Representatives margin of victory, where again these House of Representatives are broken down into districts within each state, and the boundaries are drawn by groups. And look at these margin of victories, averages up in the 40s and 30s. Very different than what we see in the presidential election. And then we can see the percentage of House seats changing. So these things change back and forth quite a bit. But that margin of victory compared to the presidential margin of victory makes us wonder, what may be the cause of this. And so this is where we dive a little bit deeper, is to, why such discrepancies? Why was, for example, in 2004, the presidential election, the margin of victory was 2.4 percentage points, but the House of Representatives average margin of victory for each individual was 40.5%, which is significantly more. So the question is why? So here's one example. They call this Partisan Advantage. This is looking at the state of North Carolina. North Carolina has 13 seats in the House of Representatives. Its redistricting process is controlled by the state legislature, so its own state controls it. So following the 2000 census, the legislature was controlled by Democrats, who drew the district maps for the elections from 2002 to 2010. Though these maps were actually modified following some court challenges, and you can read about this down here in the bottom here. Following the 2010 census, the legislature was controlled by the Republicans, who drew the redistricting map for the elections beginning in 2012. And so you can see, here's all of our districts. So you have District 1, then you have District 2, District 3, 4, somewhere in here, and so on. And notice these boundaries are really odd. They're not, first you might think they should be uniform in shape, but it turns out that we want more uniformity in population size, which would make sense. But it's really weird how some of these boundaries are drawn. If you look at 4 follows this weird little shape right here, which is a little bit odd. And so sometimes what happens is these districts are drawn to try and gain an advantage for one political party or another. And so again, down here in the bottom, notice some of the strange shapes of the district, and they're chosen in order to maximize what they call partisan advantage, and partisan is just one party over the other. And so if we look at this here, in the 2010 Democratic maps, 45% of the state voted Democrat, 54 Republican. But so there's less Democrats that voted for there are less that voted for a Democrat than voted for a Republican. However, Democrats won 7 out of 13 seats. So they had less votes percentage-wise for their candidates, but they won more seats. And then when you look at the Republican drawn map, 51% voted Democrat, 49% voted Republican, but Democrats only got 4 out of the 13. Republicans got 9 because, again, these districts were redrawn in order to kind of maximize the amount of representatives that can come out of this. So again, this is where you can see this is politically charged, and there's some math in here that we are going to look at. So there's a lot of ways to analyze, but notice again, some of the things I pointed out. 45 in 2010, 45% is how much the Democrats received in overall vote, but they had 54% of the seats. In 2012, 51% voted Democrats, and they only controlled or had representation at 31% of the seats. So they were very underrepresented in this. So overall, Democrats, the share of the congressional vote was 6% higher in 2012 than in 2010, but their representation as far as House delegations decreased by about 23 percentage points. So you have an increase in the amount of votes, but you have a decrease in the amount of representation or delegates. So the clear lesson here when we talk from a mathematical standpoint is simply by changing the map of district boundaries, it's possible to cause a great shift in the House delegations. And it's even possible for a party to gain seats while losing voters. And that's where we're kind of mathematically going to look is, gaining seats when you lose votes or losing seats when you gain votes. Now there's this thing called gerrymandering, and the practice of district boundaries for political advantage is so common that it has its own name, gerrymandering. The original term originated in 1812 when the Massachusetts governor Elbridge Gerry created a district that critics ridicule as having the shape of a salamander, and here it is over here in this figure 12.5. He created some strange district that some artist was able to make it look like a salamander, and that's where this term gerrymandering came from. But again, it's the process and drawing the district boundaries so as to serve political interests of the politicians in charge, whichever group has kind of charge of this. So now, I know this has been a lot of history. We haven't even done anything with numbers yet, really. This last little bit, and then we'll get into some questions, is given the difficulty of answering some of these questions, courts have generally allowed very convoluted district boundaries to stand, as long as they don't violate any specific laws and meet two of the following criteria. Okay, all districts within a particular state must have very nearly equal population. So that's why when we looked at North Carolina, they were really weird shape. They didn't have the same size as far as land mass, because we need to make sure that we have nearly equal populations in every district. Okay, and this requirement is based on the principle of one person, one vote. And that came from a Supreme Court decision. Then the other is each district must be contiguous, meaning that every part of the district must be connected to every other part. So you can't, for example, break a district into two separate pieces. So if we're looking at, that's a terrible state of Utah. This probably isn't going to get much better, but oh well. So if you have the state of Utah, you can't break a district up into this corner and this corner, for example. Or you can't have a little pocket here and a pocket here and a pocket here. They have to be, the boundaries have to be touching all the way through. So that's why when we looked at the other one, and I haven't looked at the boundaries for Utah recently, but you'll see some some weird stuff like this, and maybe something like this, and then you'll see it's Salt Lake County, Utah. There's only 4, so that's obviously wrong there. But that's why you'll see these weird boundaries drawn. But they have to be a single district can't be separated into two parts of the state to gain or lose any kind of advantage. So that's kind of the history lesson. Now we'll get into some of the questions that you'll see in your homework, and let me check on how much time I've got. That's probably enough for this video, so we'll pause and we'll start in part 2.